No continuity camera. Huh? Oh. Pretty bad quality. Hello.
Hi.
Trying to make the video less horrible.
Your video looks fine.
Yeah, I'm using the iPhone and it. Hang on.
Aha.
Surprised they haven't done a few magics there. Anyway.
It's 4 p.m.
4 p.m. indeed. Yeah, I saw Peter sent an email saying he won't be here today. He's got a cold. And I've been in bed.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, no, I just since it's you, I sent the whole thing on to Les and Dave and us for some time, so we'll see what happens. But I did make some comments to them, say this thing I think I can do. Here I'm not so sure because it's missing. I mean, one of the things is they're questioning the whole point of experts reviews, saying, you know, these experts are making statements without backing them up.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, I think, you know, what the supervisors are there for, to help you decode that, because especially...
But here's the thing. What I'm trying to say, Mark, is that the supervisor said this is what I should do to begin with. So, you know,
indeed. So they can, but that indeed is the point, that they can say, okay, well, you know, they can help you decode that, because that may be the advice. But some, you know, it's all, I think, looking back, it's often sort of contextual. So you're absolutely right on the paradox appears to be this is what they told you to do, and then someone saying, well, that doesn't really work. They then ought to be in a position, because it's partly that thing of being used to the internal workings. And I think I was sort of conscious that, having worked outside academe, you know, just some things just weren't at all obvious to me in the sort of simple sense of how they're encoded.
But Mark, every time I kind of bring this up to you, it's so hard to talk because you immediately run to come with some kind of a suggestion or solution. And what I'm trying to say is there are some things in here that are mechanical that can be done. But there's a lot of things that to me indicate that they don't either, Fabian, that they simply don't get the point, which is something. But then also a lot of it goes against my supervisors. They complain about the structure of the piece. They complain about as I just said, the experts not being able to substantiate. So therefore, I just sent a message to Les saying, with these comments, do you think it can be completed? If so, I'm going to need a lot of handholding from you guys. So what's realistic? So we'll see. Anyway, Fabian, you look different today.
Yes, I'm all black and it's just glitters.
Oh, you're overexposed here. You're gray on my screen.
Ah.
Just moaning to Mark about the PhD corrections. But it's all right. It's all right. There are things that I see as being contradictions, and Mark is more experienced than me, so he's trying to make me understand things, and then I get all frustrated, and you know, such it is. But it's okay. I started just since we don't have a topic today. Just one thing this weekend, I've been, I need to focus on certain things within what I'm doing, blah blah blah. And I thought, okay, I'll write a book, just my own little book, and then it's all about, we need rich interactivity and we need this and that. It's very easy to write the first paragraphs, and it comes down to trying to make it more, because this is a problem I have with the thesis too. Scientific problem with information is information has to be about something. You can't have information in general, then it's not information. And the problem I have then is it comes into, yes, we should be able to do this. Oh, damn, that's just a product feature. So I find that a really interesting position with how we look at information and interaction from a engineering, scientific, practical, and philosophical perspective. What do you guys think?
I think a lot of ChatGPT at the moment is showing that, yeah, you can have information about nothing. People keep on using it. Doesn't mean anything, just produce strings of text looking real. So yeah, doesn't have to have a topic. I don't, I think that's provocatively, it is, I think, more
Hang
useful.
on. It has a topic and it has informational content. It may not be correct or useful or good, but it isn't nonsense, right?
We're talking about your book coming or ChatGPT?
No, I'm talking about ChatGPT.
It is nonsense.
No, it is not. It might be common sense nonsense, but it has informational value. It may be wrong, it may be a lie, it may be misguided, but if it says a sentence, Doug Engelbart invented hockey, that is information, even though it's complete nonsense. It's still information, right? What I mean is,
to me, I mean,
sorry?
If you need like it's the information is a signal of a noise, if it's just noise, randomness that looks like signal, then it's like if you have so much effort to put in that every step of the way down the reasoning, down the information you receive, you must double check everything, then it's, let's say, potential information upon verification, or for something else, let's say art, that you don't care for veracity. But if it has to be useful, without putting the onus of verification, validity, all this, then it's like so much work that yeah, it's potential for information.
Right. So this is getting very interesting, and I'm watching some porn here in the background. I'll give you the link for the transcript. You have to click on the link. It's really, really cool. Okay, so the problem with information is also different disciplines have very different ideas of what information is. For instance, entropy measures the potential for noise, basically, right? How messy can something get? And that also have that's also potential for information carrying. When you're talking about transmission of information, if you look at John Tukey's algorithms from, even pre-digital days properly, that is the transmission of bits, and these bits of themselves in that context are information, because there's a certain set of pattern of bits at ascending, and they should be as intact when they arrive. What they contain, it could be nonsense, it could be a joke, it could be wisdom, that doesn't matter because that's not what's being counted. So what I mean is, when we talk about information, for instance, in our case here, a document, whether it's a VR style document or A4 sheet, doesn't matter, will have some writing in it, maybe some pictures in it. And the way we interact with that information is very different from how many cows have been sold last week or social media messages. That's what I mean. So, the quality of information in a sense isn't really necessarily the point, but there are many different kinds of information require many different kinds of interactions, right? I mean, like I'm looking at your really cool, when I was joking earlier, but when I sent the link, your pinching, typing, controlling while in VR. You're making a point here that is so important. Why not use the right input method when you need it? Because it's appropriate. It's appropriate for that interaction and that information. And that's the thing. What you're dealing with here isn't just any information. It is the kind of information that suits that environment, right?
Yep.
And that's the point where you can have information science to an extent. But for instance, what I have bumped up against with my advisors, examiners, is what is an attribute of visual meta and what is a feature of author and reader? It's really quite hard to disentangle, because author and reader is what instantiates the idea of visual meta. So they ask a lot of questions about what's the scientific thing behind this and that. And then I start freaking out because it's, but it's really interesting to see how ignorant as a species we are on this, because doing the basic research, there isn't that much confident knowledge about these things around. This is the kind of stuff a first year university student should be able to just look up, and here we are trying to deal with it. By
Yes,
the way,
they should pick up. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, did you click on the link I said? You should have a look while we chat, because Fabian has built a nightclub.
You know where that 3D model of a nightclub comes from, or whom it's coming from?
No idea. It's just very cool.
So, how many architects working in VR did we invite to the group?
Is it Andrea?
Yes. She worked with other people on I think they call it the Open Source City Toolkit or something of the sort. Sorry, I forgot the exact name. And they released that like 10 days ago, more or less. And I thought initially, wow, that's going to look way too complex for WebEx or VR on the web on the Quest 2, but just like worked out of the box. So instead of having my little pond or minimalist setting, then yes, now I'm in a club. You're in a club too.
That's really cool. Is this the same URL that you have on our website? Because I'd love to headset it.
So that's the repository. It's not very useful, but I'm going to pull from it the name Source City Toolkit, and the name is Spectra City, which I'm also going to put in the chat.
Mark, I'm so sorry. I interrupted you there about this.
No, it's okay.
Are you keeping your thought?
Yes, I am. So of course, there are a couple already, but crack on.
Fabian, just give me a link, please, while we're listening to Mark. I just want to put it up so we can check it, if you don't mind. Oh, you did already. Thank you. No, not the source. Okay, so the actual thing is called source. Okay, so the second link is the one I've used at my headset, right?
I don't know if they put anything, so if you need to put in your headset, it's my usual thing.
Yeah, I need the usual thing. If you could please give it to me, because I can't find it right now.
There we go.
Thank you. There it is.
And I'm not sure. Okay, so the usual thing here, you can see the background in it, and you can navigate with a keyboard or in VR. That being said, I'm still in the process of basically integrating back everything, all the little explorations. I have a presentation in 10 days, so I must do it for that moment. But it means if you want to try all three inputs at once, meaning keyboard and controller and hand tracking, it would be another link which is not public yet. Okay. So now it's just hand tracking and keyboard. I mean, optionally, just hand tracking first.
Okay, I'm loading it up. And Mark, please go ahead. I'm so sorry that I just.
I know. I'm just proceeding with the Pro headset. It looks like a sort of set of pimped up aviators from in the picture. Anyway,
very actually, cool. Mark, it's interesting you say that, because one of the best features of this headset is the fact that I can see the keyboard underneath it.
All right.
So I use pass through, but the fact that it has this thing is actually the biggest benefit.
But ironically, actually, the fact that it looks more like you're wearing a pair of sort of rather out there glasses, rather than I'm looking at, one of the weirdest things in a sense of looking at, especially the sort of buff coloured Oculus headset. You're very aware you're looking at somebody who's wearing something glommed to the front of their head. You may not know what it is. You might know. Funnily enough, just as a sort of an interesting aspect, you know, of, in a sense, being, I know this is a virtual room, being in the same room as someone using the equipment like that, that strikes me as far less abstract, just the look of it, than previous headsets. It may well be an accident to design. I'm sure that wasn't necessarily, you know, done for that reason.
Yeah, by the way, Mark, you really should put your Oculus on, because Fabien, am I right in understanding that the rectangle, the cube on my left hand, depending on how I touch it, it toggles wireframe?
Yeah, if you tap with your index of the other hand, it's going to turn it on and off.
That's absolutely phenomenal. Mark, you have to see this, because it's a view spec, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really useful, and it's so handy, literally. I didn't mean to make that pun, but that's a really elegant way to literally have your hand choose. Wow.
Yeah, see if I had to stow away a whole lot of stuff the other day, so we'll just check if the batteries are up on this.
Fabien, are you in the same room as me here now?
No, I think this one is, I mean, it's not networked now, I think.
Okay.
Sure. Again, that's going back to the integration part. I need to bring it all back together as.
Yeah, this is really cool. You use the Pro now as well, right?
The what?
The Pro headset?
Yeah. Well, that's why I also started today the keyboard plus controller plus hands, is because I want to use the Pro with the writing pen tip, so that then one can draw on a surface, eventually either extrude or draw whatever they want. But like, yeah, have all, now it would be 4 different kind of input, using the controllers with all the buttons, but also the pen, and draw on the surface with the pen, and the keyboard, and the hand tracking, and the virtual keyboard also.
Right. Okay. Oh, sorry, Mark. I thought you were coming in. What were we going to say about the first point? I feel horrible being.
Oh no, I just held on to the thought you were asking about way back about sort of GPT and things. And I preface this by saying that I'm not making the observation, because I always hate sort of zero-sum arguments, but I'm probably more aligned to the opening thought that yes, it doesn't mean anything. It's an artifact, but it's a nonsense artifact. It's a simulacra of reality, but it isn't, because it's just something made to look real based on an unknown process. That's not to decry all the work that goes into making it or the attention to detail in that, but as it exists at the moment, we don't know why it churns out what it churns out. And I was reminded, Dini sent me a recording of the lecture I gave to her class the other day, and as with some of the auto transcription that happens here, it's clear that, you know, systems train LLMs using American English don't cope very well with British English accents, and why should they? Because they haven't been trained on them, and it just shows the narrowness. So whilst I might type something in Chat GPT, I suspect if I was using Devanagari or, you know, some other language, I suspect I wouldn't get that because it won't have been trained on such a big corpus. And I don't feel any sense of moral panic, but I'm slightly depressed that people are so easily excited by something, you know, so simple, because I see it more like an artwork. And the other thing is, I wonder, well, why are we using it? A lot of it's out of this conceit that I don't have time. My time is always valuable, other people's time is not. So as long as my time is saved, then all is good, and I don't have to worry about the rest because it's somebody else's problem. And so it's on a step to something, but I do just wonder. But I have seen some very interesting things. I've been tracking the Discord. I've actually been, I can't remember what it's called, the one that the Discord, maybe I'll bring it up a second. I can't remember what it's called. The one that Alan mentioned called HyperTalk, which actually I found some quite interesting sort of things in. I don't really have time to dive into it fully, but I've been tracking along. And one observation there was someone saying, well, funnily enough, and although it sounds even more hilarious as a notion, actually using a sort of GPT as an assistant in programming is potentially interesting because it's a harder edged environment. It's a more enclosed environment. You probably could get more tractability out of the process, even though it is an artificiality. But I just worry about people writing screeds and screeds and screeds of basically possible nonsense. Well, I mean, the point is we don't know what it is. To what point?
Well, Mark, I agree with some of your points, but to say that it's just an art project and nonsense, you just brought up the exact reason it isn't. And that is demonstrably true and useful when it helps with programming, because the programming can be run and it either works or it doesn't. So this thing is very, very powerful, but I'm not saying that it's something that should be used to, you know, develop philosophies or anything like that, but it does have some real world uses, don't you think?
I think it does. I do have a genuine concern that we embrace these things for the wrong reasons. So suddenly, you know, someone says, "Oh, I can sack all the stuff because I can write all the news articles with this thing," or we use really utilitarian arguments. Whereas where I've seen people suggesting it's safe for use in doing some work inside large coding projects, I think the thought in it is actually far more considered, and there is some sense of what could go wrong and why it would go wrong. Whereas the closer you get out to the broader public, you know, what's the point in writing an essay if you're going to use GPT for it? You've learned nothing and you've achieved nothing apart from you had someone to hand in. And somewhere on that, you know, and somewhere on that spectrum, you move from the sense of something being having a useful deliverable output, and the other end is more like an artwork. Yes, it's fine, you can do it, but it hasn't really achieved very much. And you can look at it and wonder for the fact it exists, but not necessarily get much more from it.
Well, you know, this is a really interesting discussion, and it is a complicated discussion because, you know, it is interesting that people who use spell check, you know, this is not my point. Someone made the point. We have absolutely no issue with someone using spell check or using grammar check and a lot of different services. But for some reason, when it comes to this, we have concerns. And this is just a point. I'm not saying it should be different. But obviously, students and other people, you know, we're all lazy. There will be opportunity, you know, there will be somebody who will use whatever means to make something easier. So that will happen. But because I agree with you intellectually, this is partly why I've been really focused on the defined concepts. And if you can provide a set of linked defined concepts in a useful hypertextual way that also fits the academic model, maybe it can deal with this. So I am afraid that I do agree with you, particularly on the reality, but people aren't going to agree with us. They're still going to do some bullshit.
It's interesting someone mentions, but I don't really see the problem about using a spell. I see a problem about using a spell checker with no human in the loop. A spell checker will tell you that you're not very good typist, and you know, I constantly get left hand, right hand input order wrong, and in fact, spell checkers are rather bad at picking that up. Ironically, you'd think they were clever enough to work out distance based on, because they know the order of keys on a standard English keypad in terms of, you know, the QWERTY layout. So it wouldn't be particularly difficult to therefore make that one of the search algorithms as what, you know, this word has been typed, which is not in the dictionary. What is it? And often it comes out with hilariously bad guesses. I mean, it'll spot that it's not right, but it doesn't know why. And it's quite interesting to notice actually that messages has a very, very different and far less capable spell checker than some other things. And I only assume that's attuned possibly to the lesser computing power available on a handset than it is on a laptop. There, by the by, I guess. But I mean, using a spell checker, I mean, I do, because I know I'm a cack-handed typist, but I wouldn't ever want to use a spell checker in the sense that I send something, it goes through a spell checker unseen by me and comes out at the end, because that to me would be rubbish, because the best guess of the spell checker may very well be wrong. But so a spell checker for me is useful to tell me the word that a word something, bounded by a couple of spaces or punctuation is not a known word, and then I would normally know what it is. And I might use a correction or I just retype it. But so there's a danger of confecting two different things there. Where someone was suggesting that a spell checker is sort of a bad thing, in the sense that you might use it without a human in the loop. Yes, I just think that's a particularly farcical, because what you get is the same problem you get with early dictation software, where you end up with word soup because you're
I do agree on all these points. But I don't think the rest of the world would necessarily agree. They're still going to do it anyway. Don't you think? Which is a real problem. I'm not just throwing it away, but
well, what are you suggesting they're doing anyway?
That at least parts news. I mean, there are news stories now that are written by AI that we read that are part of the feeds already. And I am sure that some students are already trying to use ChatGPT to do basic essays. I'm not at all saying it's a good idea. But I mean, what I tried to do with this from the beginning in terms of product design was I would love to have a feature in Author whereby you're writing and you get to a point you don't know what to write, you hit the question mark and it'll suggest something for you. You won't be able to copy and paste it, but it'll suggest something, and that may be enough of a spark to get you to the next stage. But
the thought that springs to mind is, as said by Doug and Henry Ford and Einstein, all sorts of other people, thinking is hard. If thinking is as hard as looking at the choices offered by the machine and picking one, that's not really thinking.
Okay, but okay, Mark, let's, as I said, I agree with you on an intellectual level, which is why I'm looking at other ways where people can express themselves and understand what people are expressing. But I think that if we are just arguing against its use, then we are, because I also think it should be responsible use. We are just, I can't think of the most appropriate sentence, but people are going to do it anyway. But they just are.
Well, then they may do. That doesn't make. I mean, that doesn't make it right or something to suggest. I totally agree. They will do. What I was sort of thinking about was, just as you said, well, I get to a question mark, and rather than me think about what I come next, something suggests something, which none of the suggestions may really be what I was thinking about. But because it's there and it's in color on screen provided by the computer, human beings, being generally lazy, myself included, will probably pick one of the things and go off down a completely different rabbit hole. And that doesn't matter on one level. I mean, it depends how trivial. If it's deciding whether you have beans or soup for supper, fine. But it may not be that trivial. And as humans, we're actually remarkably bad, I think, about making those value judgments. So the challenge with this is how, without sort of going into some flight of moral panic, how you sort of use it appropriately in terms of being able to even use it, and how you teach people when it's appropriate. An interesting experiment to do would be to use something like that and insert a marker every time an artificial choice was chosen. In other words, where in this output did the computer decide where to go, and where did the human decide where to go? The point being that if they used one of the prompts, they let the computer decide. Just to get a handle on what it means, because at the moment we're in a sense, I accept, talking conjecturally.
Yeah, okay. I mean, as from the position of an academic or a teacher, I think what you're saying makes sense, but all I can just repeat is people are still going to just do it. They're just going to use it. It's a way to cheat. So,
but so what? I mean, so people will cheat, but it doesn't. I mean, just because people do something, people steal money from banks, but I don't think I'm going to start doing it just because people do. I'm picking it deliberately. I'm taking a deliberately hilarious example, but I'm just trying to make the point that I don't understand the utility of the argument of just saying, well, people do it.
Because
it doesn't absolve us from trying to understand how it works.
Because it makes things easier. Right. One of the things from my mother's generation is that she found it weird that our generation couldn't remember phone numbers. And this is even before, today with digital phones. It's like, and also she finds it offensive to an extent, before at least, that when you're at a cash register in a shop, the people there don't do, if you give them £100, they don't do the numbers in their head. The fact that they use a calculator, and this is not a joke. She actually wonders, why can't you do the subtraction? There are many different faculties at different points. If AI can help really give us useful prompts, it may be as useful as talking to a person. Many persons are stupid depending on the situation, you and me, of course, included, particularly me. So I don't think it's necessarily the ignorance of the machine, but either way, I don't think it's like a criminally bad thing if they use it. Some people may, I don't know. Okay,
I'm not suggesting it is a criminally bad thing. I think part of the issue, fair enough, is our inability to see the line between true general artificial intelligence and whatever the correct term is for basically something that's a large trained model. What we have at the moment are large trained models, or worse, when you read some of the shenanigans going on with sort of the Tesla auto driving, where they're perhaps being less than honest about what they're doing. I understand why they want to sell a tech and things, but that rather puts into perspective this thing, the temptation to cheat, not in terms of the people using it, but the people telling you things work in the way that in fact they don't. Like anything new, comes with some challenges for us.
Yeah, no, of course, absolutely. It comes with challenges for us. But also in the future of text community, I think we need to decide on what kind of focus to have and structure to have going forward. We're doing well with the roughly monthly presentations. But, we're not trying to do a reinventing, or rather inventing a VR world these days. So I think that should be one of our points of discussion. What's going on? What do you both have? Considering there's only 3 of you today, what do you feel about that?
Ask Fabian, I've been talking.
I think you may have
oh, okay.
For a while.
It's just because he's not on screen. I didn't want to sort of, crowd anyone out.
I'm still here.
Okay. Well, do you have a thought, Fabian, on that?
I do have a thought, but it's mostly frustration.
Frustration is an honest thought.
Yeah, it's kind of weird for me because I did invest quite a bit of time, like months, if not years, in generative AI. And that was before VR, so 6-7 years ago. I didn't do personally, professionally, anything good with it. I think it's a hard problem. I think it's a fascinating one. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent so long on it. And everything I see now is still like a mechanical Turk. It's still it's empty to me. So that's why the frustrations come from. And I guess a little bit also of envy, because I see people like swimming in money because of it. Also, I don't know if you read the Time article published a week ago or so. They explain a bit how the filtering is done with a human paid $2 per hour. Yeah. I mean, it's not beside the economical aspect of it. Like, I wouldn't wish this kind of job to my worst enemy. So that, which again, it's I understand the economical perspective. People need to work somehow to pay the rent. But at what drives me a bit nuts is like how much a tool is put on a pedestal while people basically refuse to see how the sausage is made. It's like, if you were to go see how it's done, also in terms of energy costs and whatnot, I think most people would be a lot more critical about it. So I definitely understand the interest for it. And I do think, again, it's a fascinating area, and it's it's still, despite all this, underused or exploited. But how this specific thing is done, and so far the usages I've seen of it, in terms of basically creating noise, like SEO articles to be at the top rank of Google that is already broken, to break the system even more. Or people that like, oh, I'm going to answer my email like this automatically, so I'm just putting this on the record. If somebody does send me an email from ChatGPT and it's noise, I will consider them responsible for it. Like, you're responsible for the tool you use. If somebody wastes my time with noise, like as if the answering machine would be generated and it's bullshit, I'm really not going to enjoy this. So far, I still see again the big picture, the potential for it, because I invested myself in it. But it's very frustrating to see that so far I've not seen things that really put stars in my eyes, and I've seen a lot of more, the costs of it. And I say this because I also have this at the Parliament. We discussed a lot about this and the different implementation. It's not my specific focus, but it's a very trendy topic, obviously. But it's not, so far I think most people are it's interesting. It's interesting. We're going to see how people keep on paying for it, what actually comes out of it. But most of the examples I've seen on Reddit also in terms of image generation, all this is wrong. And I commented recently, maybe the most interesting piece, the scariest was the Time article on people getting paid for the really horrible things to watch and check. But the maybe more fundamental one was Wolfram, Stephen Wolfram, who designed Wolfram Alpha, which, for just a bit of context, is a little bit like Wikidata, so a curated data set, but mixed with a little bit of NLP so that you can query it without using like Mathematica or Octave or something more numerical based, let's say, or focused. And he was saying, like, and I understand the guy is basically trying to sell his tool, like, oh, if you just plug ChatGPT with Wolfram Alpha, then at least the veracity will be there. And I think this makes no sense to me. It's like, oh, you produce like a stream of text, a paragraph or a book or a chapter, and then you inject facts in it. It's like, no, you write a text because you have new interacting fact, something that's shocking to you, that surprise, like a new, maybe not all the way to a new theory or new view for the whole world, but like, I don't know, hypertext or a new way to do interaction. But it's new, like this is something, and then you can explain, but it's not like injecting facts and then having sentence around it for the beauty of it. So I think that there is something fundamentally off, that somehow we try to make streams of words that make no sense and the veracity doesn't matter. And then we try to correct it. Like, no, it's the mistakes or the novelty that has to make for some justification.
Sorry, Twitter making noises. Why does Twitter do that? Yeah, no, I think we agree with those frustrations, Fabian.
It's interesting, Ray, Twitter. I must say, I've used Tweetbot for years, and since it got killed off, I haven't really looked at Twitter, and I'm not sure my world has been any worse for it. And I'm trying to muster the interest to look at Mastodon. But I'm rather actually finding I'm just going back to other places I used to find information that are less driven by an algorithm. And by that, I don't mean, this is nothing again, the fact that people are still posting on Twitter as it is, but more the fact that the social pressure to use these systems across the piece is an interesting one we can.
For God's sake. I was just trying to find a tweet, but I think the one I posted here is the one. Did you see the one up here? I think it relates to what you were saying. The one posted at 1636.
Let's have a look. 1630. Sorry.
Yeah, the last one.
Yeah.
That sums it up pretty well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But also two other questions. First of all, just a practical one, Fabian, to you. What do you think of the pass-through with the Pro? I think it is too noisy. It's too jittery. So it's actually distracting. And also about reading text. I think that the screen door effect is too strong. I think the Quest 2 was actually better, even though it was low resolution. What do you think?
I don't care. Sorry. I mean, yes, it might be better in some way and worse in some way. It's just that I'm maybe naively confident that the trend, a bit like mobile phone, and maybe because we use mobile phones so much, is going to keep on improve. And also maybe it's not even that. Even if it were to cap in terms of resolution, refresh rate, and whatnot, to me it's usable enough to do completely novel things, and it changed the way I think. So I keep on pumping prototypes for the last couple of days, actually, unlocking quite a few things. And maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm like selling or drinking the Kool-Aid to the point that I don't even get it anymore. But yeah, for this, so to me, it's good. It's like a really good pen, bad pen. If it helps you write stuff on the piece of paper and you couldn't really do that before, wow, that's already good enough. Sure, I would prefer, again, highest refresh rate, highest density, highest field of view. But for me right now, let's say, let me put it a little less provocative. I don't want to be always provocative. To me, it's good enough to keep on having a rather long runway of things I still want to try. Like, even if it was just as is for 1 year, I would still be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think it's good for novel things, but I'm also trying to use it for normal work as a virtual monitor, and for that.
Yeah.
That's where I think I'm working here and it's fine. And then there's all this jitter in my peripheral vision, which is not where you want jitter. So I just wondered what you thought about that. But yeah, for a lot of VR native stuff, yeah, I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, that's also why I spend quite a bit of time on hand tracking. It's like being able to take an object in space and move it naturally. To me, it's still, I'm not like, wow, every time. I'm not literally mind blown every time, but it's still kind of crazy. Like I can, it's going back to Agent Z, being able to make something float easily, conveniently, efficiently, actually, to make it do things like Lego in the air. Yeah, we can do quite a bit. But in terms of, for example, my keyboard there, my what's the name? I'm walking now. I'm on the treadmill because I need to also. I had a bit of. I'm not going to put on the camera, but let's say I had a very nice Christmas period. So in terms of diet, not ideal. So I need to do a lot more sport. I can't really do this in VR easily. So anyway, point is, I really like my desktop as is. I don't try to reproduce it in VR. So, but if I were to, I think I would be frustrated for next, I don't know, actually, maybe 2-3 years more, maybe. I'm not sure. Not too long, but still quite a bit.
Yeah.
What do you mean by screen door? Are you meaning like a sort of moire effect?
No, I just mean the lines between the pixels.
Oh, okay. Right.
They seem really pronounced, and I don't think they were as well. Still have the two. I guess I should compare it.
I think it's a little bit better now. But what's funny to me, it's like it's a little bit the same time I went from. I think I try to keep my phone for as long as I can, and I went from the 6S to the XS, and it's the first time I took the XS, I was like, I don't need a screen with that resolution. It's pretty pointless. And then I went back to the 6S and I was like, wow, there is like 5 pixels in total in that thing. How much to read this? So I think the first time you switch, let's say, to a high resolution screen or refresh rate, maybe you're blown away. You use it for like a week, I mean, if you use it often enough, it just disappears. And even after this, it's like, oh, you notice all the imperfection, all the little things here and there. And then you need again the higher quality one. So I think it's better, but now you pass that point of getting used to it and you start to notice more the imperfections.
I hear what you're saying. I think that's a fair enough point, but you know, just no, I've even changed the colors in Author to be more high contrasts so that it would kind of meld more, and I still find it uncomfortable to read. Already, I think I have some kind of dyslexia, because reading academic documents that are just in columns, I just, unless it's extremely well written, I can't do it. And even reading my own stuff when it's, you know, really chunky. So to try to make it a bit bigger in VR, it's better, but to have to fight the columns of text and the fact that the letters have, I understand what you're talking about with older phones and laptops and stuff, but we had lower resolution, but we didn't have screen door for a very long time. There weren't lines between them. And those lines are really breaking up the shape of the characters in my perspective.
So do you read, I don't know if you read real newspapers anymore, but so do you find it difficult to read column text in newspapers?
A lot of it has to do with well, okay, when I read, because you're talking about columns and not screen door.
Yeah, sorry.
Newspapers are difficult because most articles, news articles, tend to have the information in the second paragraph. So you have personal story, news, and then you have a reminder of everything.
Yeah.
So it's like going through. I mean,
No, that's the content. I was thinking
I
you saying
understand,
that.
but I understand, but it's muddying the perspective. But when I read The Economist, even on my phone, because it is very well written, I don't have a problem reading it all. That's easy, you know, page by page. Also, The Atlantic Monthly, no problem. I think.
Well, are you there seem to be two things mixed here, is whether you sort of like engage with the content and the presentation, because, and I'm not arguing against, I'm not making a point here, I'm just trying to understand, because I too don't particularly like columns, but I am aware that one of the reasons it's done, quite apart from sort of density, is that supposedly people don't like reading really wide text, or it slows your reading speed down, I suppose, because the saccades get longer.
I did actually measure this. No, of course, I'm messing up the content and the presentation, because obviously better content, the presentation matters less, of course. I think it's 7 to 8 words. There's optimal in columns. The columns are great in that sense, which is why reading a single column on a phone is great. It mixes quite well.
Yeah.
Reading double column, double spread on a computer screen, though, even 16-inch, a lot of the early PDF, ACM layouts and the type is just so awful. It is.
Well, it's partly that you're right. I mean, I find it's the type density. I mean, one of the things that it's certainly easier to read I find a lot of websites at the moment, because what has happened over time is that, lo and behold, you know, people have actually given the text a bit more space to breathe, and you can tweak it further if you need to get a comfortable size or, you know, layout for the device or the space that you're using, which is a cruel irony, because PDF kills that stone dead, unless you probably built a very elegant one, but that's probably less than 1% of PDFs. But I suppose this is my point about actually, you know, the idea that I might write an article now and it die in a document that turns it into unusable text because all the structural stuff smushed into the words that are written, instead of preserving it at least somewhere in that file, rather I mean, it's akin to what you're doing in a sense with visual meta. You're saying, okay, there's some information in here, so you going hunting around for it, here it all is a usable, actionable form. It's a bit like saying, here's my printed, beautifully typeset PDF, but you don't want to do that. You actually want to stick in a machine learning thing, or you want to rerun it into something else. You don't need that screen version. What you need is here is the text, and off you go. But most PDFs can't do that.
Yeah, but the question of just readability also comes down to, yeah, I mean, it comes down to a lot. And like Vince said in an email conversation of this, we should study it more, but at a certain point, we have to be paid to study these damn things. It would be nice. Anyway, but also, Fabienne, what Mark and I was talking about a little bit earlier was the kind of point and focus of our community here, because last year we were all gung-ho changing VR and so on. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that now.
Isn't the theme education this year, or?
And this year is supposed to be a theme around text and education, yeah, but that's quite wild. It's a wide topic, and as you can see today, there's only two of you here, so I'm wondering what the best way forward, because we've already cut down on how many how many meetings we have and so on.
I think people maybe simply might be confused with the agenda. Like, I was expecting today to have the presentation that didn't happen on Friday, so I was confused then. So it might be as basic as that.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're having, David, he's going to be in February now. I can't remember exactly what date, but it's in the calendar. So
yeah, I think actually, funnily enough, I mean, the people who know, but it's probably worth restating. So because as we sort of rolled into the holiday period, the sort of calendar, in a sense, the calendar or the tempo of things has shifted. So probably sort of restating, which sort of days are regular meetings, and whether. I can totally understand that, for instance, some presentations may be driven by when people are available, and that might make you do it at the end of the week. And I don't think people will worry too much about that. They can either make it or they can't. But I suspect there may be some confusion as to when we're meeting. I mean, those who've done this often enough will probably just check on a Monday, Friday, if they're free on the grounds that something might be going on. So restatement's probably good. I'll shifting back to your other point. I think it lies within the overall thing of education stuff. I rolled out of the Christmas period with a much stronger sense of the thing I want to spend much more time on, and I'm much more interested in is knowledge and sense making. I'm less interested in rote work.
I've got it open the door, but I think that's a very good point.
I'll just wait till Fred comes back. Well, that's creepy. his camera's reaching for something to focus on.
That's how we find ghosts, I think. Just for the anecdote, by the way, since it's your camera was moving, trying to find a human, I guess.
Yeah, it's that AI,
Yeah, that's it.
And for the little anecdote, I was starting to say that it's funny that I don't believe in ghosts. I'm like a materialist also, and I see there has to be something physical. Anyway, big picture is at some point I was seeing things in shadows, or not seeing things, but like wondering, had some kind of like slimmer of a doubt, and that's been maybe 10 or 20 years ago, I would say. And what's kind of funny is since then, I have not watched either scary or horror movies or, those kind of like TV shows where they look for spirits or whatnot. And not once have I had any doubts like, oh, it's a shadow, oh, it's an effect from a light, oh, it's a whatnot. So I think there is like a pretty strong correlation between what you expect to see based on just whatever kind of content you consume, and if you forget that it's even just a possibility, you're not looking up for it, and then you just like whoosh, pass right through you.
Yeah, it was
No,
useful. I went on to, I was reading an article on Wired, and in the sidebar, I never normally look at those little talking head boxes, and but because now everyone turns subtitles on, I even in my sort of partial vision, I was seeing it, and it was actually a neuroscientist, and nationally answering, pop questions on Twitter, but actually a lot of them boiled down to people were asking about various of these sort of visual, I don't know what you call them, but you look at a picture and you don't see what you see perspective where it shouldn't be, or it's all these effects. And he was making the point that yes, so much of our reality is entirely constructed, and we don't even know how we do it yet. And I think that's interesting, and I think that's one of the challenges is that, in one corner of the room you've got people saying, well, we just need to encode how humans think, and in the other corner of the room there are people saying, we still don't know how humans think, and I'm not sure the two talk as much as they should. But going back to knowledge stuff.
Hang on, I just wanted to tell Fabian, because what you're saying, Mark, is more important, but just to get you up to date. Hang on, let me just pause recording.
Okay, well, one of the things is actually sort of recently just pulled me, back onto the track I'm suggesting was I did this lecture for actually undergraduate course at Washington State, so Dini's classroom. So really nice. 22 undergraduates bothered to get into a 9 o'clock lecture to hear people talk about hypertext. Who'd have thought it was impossible? But it's really interesting that the one question that came from a student at the end rather made my heart sink. And they're saying, well, how can hypertext, which in the way it was phrased, being like this old thing that you've just told us about, be used to explain arguments better? And I thought, oh, we're stuck in social media again. And this obsession we have at the moment, the only reason we don't all agree is because we somehow haven't displayed our argument well enough. And I do think it's more complicated than that. And what it also says to me is how simplistic we are in a lot of our sort of interaction and understanding of our knowledge. There's a real renaissance in sort of, gosh, in the last few years or so of in the sort of personal knowledge management space, the Roman Obsidian, Notion, all these really interesting, which by and large, without to be and in no way speak ill of them, seem some sort of a wiki warmed over. But it's interesting how they seem to appeal far more to engineering types, because basically you have lots of hard-edged boxes, and knowledge exploration becomes a process where you put the stuff in the boxes, and then you sort of, I guess, you press the magic 8-ball button, and that's knowledge. And what tends to happen is people fill up all the buckets, find there's no knowledge, then buy the next app, because as we know, the next bit of software is always better. And I'm sure as a prototyper, Fabian can accord with that, but for much more laudable reason in your case. Yeah, and it just sort of got me thinking, and I'm writing a book with someone at the moment on, well, it's ostensibly about using a tool called Tinderbox, but actually it's far more about thinking and knowledge tools, because so many of the ideas abstract back. And it's made me realize just how much we have become slaves to process, or our understanding of making sense of things. For many of us, our first reaction is to reach for a process. And what we do is we put all our effort into following the process and give little, if any, thought to why we're doing the process and to what end. And just recently I had an interesting discussion with somebody who's trying to use an open map. So in the context of the group here, if you think about like the map view, what we're calling it in Author, but you can put things, move them around on a large virtual surface. I see something like that as a thinking space. If it's just an auto-mapped graph, it's an auto-mapped graph. It doesn't really, it's not that it tells you nothing, but it answers the question you asked it. The problem is a lot of these things do that bit for you. So it gives you an answer to a question you didn't know you'd asked. And what you see is what appears to be a certainty about you're not sure what, which is, I think, why people use these things for a bit and give up. Whereas it was very interesting. The person I was dealing with was effectively doing about the most old-fashioned thing you can do. They were writing close reading notes. So they're sort of, he's working on Cyrillic texts, and I'm not quite sure his field, but so he's literally taking a paragraph of text and then writing very, very sort of close-grained thoughts about them. Something you probably would have done on paper, and probably still people do, mostly in the humanities. And it's sometimes hard to see, okay, well, apart from doing that in something you can sort of print out digitally, where's the advantage? And he kept saying, but unless I can, basically saying, unless I can see it, it's not there. And I need to be shown how exactly something's done. I said, but you're talking about your internal thought process, and you're asking people who don't even understand your domain to show you precisely how your mind works. And maybe that's the wrong way in. And that's, one of the sort of strands I'm pulling out at the moment. Freud.
I thought you were also going to talk about where you'd like to see the community go and towards sense making and stuff. I would really like to hear more about that as well.
Okay, well, I mean, I was giving you the last bit as context to why I'm thinking as I am, and I think, funnily enough, one of the things that I found most interesting, although slightly tangential to what we were doing last year, was the idea of a virtual environment as this open space, as this open explorable space, and sort of confronting the fear that we just use it as another graph, or whether we actually use it as an exploratory space in a way that I think I'd find really exciting. It's not difficult, and I think it's more challenging than I really imagined, in the sense that we are, certainly most people in the sort of Western educational tradition are taught to linearize from a very early age. So that's our safety blanket. If in doubt, make a list.
Yeah, but
and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, I hasten to add. But I think, depending on one's sort of, I guess, probably the way one's mind works, I'm clearly something of an outlier. Moving outside that comfort becomes quite hard. So a lot of people really, really struggle with the idea of anything that's non-linear, whether it's something on a big exploded board, or whether it's posted on a wall, or whatever. They keep reaching for the safety blanket of the outline whilst wanting the insight of the non-linear form. And it's got me to the point where I've been talking with my co-author about, well, are we actually writing a book, or are we writing a hypertext, which will, when we finish, figure out what parts you can put in a book, which is something I hadn't envisaged when it started.
Right. So on the back of that, we have to decide what makes most sense for our community this year. So we get together for something we like rather than not. The process I've gone through is, I thought for a while, yay, I'm going to do the future of text focused on academia and education, because clearly text and education is really important. And then a friend of mine, who was the voice of Lisa lives in Australia, she called me up when I texted this, absolutely mad, and said, are you crazy? Educators don't give a shit. She's been spending 7 years working for Microsoft to sell educators in Australia technology. She said, if you want to do that, it can be done, but you got to find the thought leaders. You got to make them feel like they're the ones doing it. It's really, really, really tough. So that was a very useful cold water on my personal dreams. So what Mark said now really links up with, instead of going for a demographic, we go for a psychographic. And I think it'll still be under the notion of text for education or something. But instead of just going to universities and people, we really try to talk to these tools for thought people. And we really talk about the issue of, what does that mean? How does text fit? And then specifically Mark's issue, I would frame it differently. But yes, I think there's a little bit of stamp collecting going on. If I just put these things in the nice pages and the colors are lined up, I will know more stuff. And then the other side, of course, now is the AI will do the thinking for me almost. So I really would like to know what Fabienne and Peter has to say about focusing the community this year around text for learning and thinking or something. Over.
So I don't know if I'll start rambling and maybe that might help. My personal view on this, both actually on using PIM and PKM and any kind of tool for thought, has actually, I think, changed quite a bit from actually one of the reasons I started to use PIM and PKM was to avoid having the same thought twice. The goal was like, I want novel thoughts. If I already thought about that problem, it has to be in a better way, a deeper way, etc. So I need to put stuff down because I cannot memorize everything. So I'm going to delegate to a substrate, a medium that's going to be good enough. So that was the whole motivation behind it, is to avoid being stuck in places, in thinking places that are not good enough, let's say. So that's the reason. That's also one of the reasons I started to start with generative AI, is because like, oh, that's going to help me to get novel thoughts. And yeah, I did not pursue this because I think the quality is not good enough. But why do I mention this is because I also gave up on the idea that my PIM or PKM itself is going to help me understand better. And it's just like the hard fun, the putting the effort in it, that even regardless of understanding myself better through my data, is like I do something, just like the same way, I don't know, if you walk more, running a marathon is going to be easier. It's like, well, I think more, I think through either programming or writing notes or changing. Yes, I'm on a treadmill. It also helped me think. So, but yes, I think you always, anytime you put some effort into improving your tool, I mean, it's not always going to pay back, but it's very rarely a waste of time as long as you learn something doing it. And that's now a lot more on how I see PIM and PKM or any kind of tool for thought. It's really more, I enjoy the process, just that's a pleasure I have regardless of efficiency. But then the more thinking I put in for this, the more efforts I put in, the more confident I am that somehow it's going to improve without any expectation of like somehow an answer or a deeper understanding of myself. So that's, let's say, the naive way, like putting efforts in and being rather confident that every time it's going to make it a tiny bit easier. In terms of like the community behind it, we had a brief discussion on Friday with Camille, because he works specifically on this, and one of the way he can help is like, yeah, explain a bit more his tool, the people he knows, and the community behind it. So that would be a very pragmatic. He promised us a presentation. He's still working on it though, but he can definitely help there. More on Obsidian specifically, but he knows the field quite a bit.
Well, I hope the links for use, and do because I know it's always sort of difficult writing to complete strangers. So if there's anything I gave them that doesn't work, you know, do tell them for heaven's sakes to give me a prod. You're muted.
It does seem we're quite aligned, but you know, Fabian, you're phenomenally good at finding monthly speakers. I don't think we should be another productivity forum. I don't think we should be another tools for thought forum. I think we need to really focus on text, but not just any text. The first year of the book was any text, very, very much on purpose. It could be typography or writing, whatever it might be. Now I think we need to be more editorially strong for how we do our conversations and what the book and the symposium is going to be. So hang on, let me just check here. When I was writing my frustrated thoughts, I'm not sure if it's, yeah, it's basically why write? There's two main reasons to write. One is to communicate with others. One is to help you think. Of course, there are external reasons such as, you know, status and proving things and all of that. But the actual act of writing itself, one of them is helping us think. So maybe the writing to think angle seems to fit. What things?
Yeah, because ironically, I find the writing bit is the bit that tends to go by the board. Thinking about the writing gets me sort of blast straight through the writing and out the other side to the thought I was after, which isn't particularly helpful in terms of sharing with others. But I make that observation for what it's worth.
One of the things with my absolutely horrendous PhD thesis is they wanted a definition of the term interaction, which I think is on purpose a red herring because there isn't such a thing. When you look through the literature, people have questioned it and asked what other people is and say it's not just things doing this, it's things doing this plus all kinds of stuff. So that's a bit bizarre, but also that really bothered me is I make the case that rich interaction is important and can help us think and communicate. And they're saying I haven't proved that point. So, and obviously that's a personal frustration with me with these guys. However, in our community, maybe that's exactly what we should focus on. You know, can rich interaction with text help us think? That may be the theme.
What would you describe as rich interaction? If I had to tell someone, if I walked out of this room and I had to tell them we've just been talking about rich interaction, what would I'm sort of, this isn't a provocation. This is me actually thinking, gosh, I'm not sure. I think I might struggle with that.
It is a provocation, but it's a good provocation. Absolutely. I would say that Ted Nelson kind of framed it quite well when he said that cut and paste on the Mac is horrendous because what you cut disappears. If you cut and paste on paper, which is what he used to do when he made his books, you had the cut thing right there and you could move it somewhere else. That was useful. Sorry, is that my computer playing music for some absolute unknown reason?
Not me.
That's weird. Oh, I know what it is. It's auto playing one of my art videos by someone that does music. Sorry about that. So having that as a starting point, interactive text is a continuum. Even the very, very oldest text you could interact with, because first of all, you could read it. That is an interaction. Number two, you could deface it somehow by annotating it, scratching it out, underlining it, or whatever. So it really is a continuum. And in a digital environment, we have basic interactions like copy, paste, edit, and all these things. So the question is, if we go beyond this and beyond basic interactive into richly interactive, we should be able to do things like view specs, where you can change just the font, that's a view spec, but also change the layout to better reflect your reading style. You should be able to see, so the interactions give two affordances specifically. One is the view and two is the connections.
So playing that back, it's in the richness is partly as a device. It's basically speaking to the novelty, not in a trivial sense, but the novelty in the sense of doing stuff that hasn't been done before. It's differentiating interaction that we may do now that up to this point we either haven't been able to do at all, or we've done in a much more impoverished way.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and it's a completely what's that word where someone, it's an aspirational concept because we'll never get there. There will always be another interaction that we would like to have for the next stage. Absolutely. So when I'm talking about interactions and connections, Peter is typing in the chat in the text about link rot and those types of things. They're really, really important. And what I thought was my contribution with my thesis was visual meta, which is an approach to an infrastructure to allow for this. That's it, right? But because it's so simple, there are all kinds of academic things, but that's not really pertinent for this. But for this discussion, whether we do it in Fabian's type of VR world on a flat thing, maybe we should look at the value of rich interaction for thinking, or do you have other words? I would really love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, to be honest, it reminds me of the presentation I gave in London. I'm not actually like a professor in UX or design or interfaces, so I'm a little bit worried of using the wrong word, but yeah, rich interactions. Why not? I don't have the academically correct answer there.
It seems to me that you and Brandel are quite close in this, in the sense of it's, you know, you want to use your hands, you want to use your body, you want to use all your senses. So that's the rich part. And interaction is not just do it as a dancer, nothing wrong with being a dancer, but it's not just for yourself as a dancer, it is to have an effect on your information environment and for you to understand the world. Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, we got sidetracked by something you were just saying, and I'll let me pick up on that first, because one of the things, perhaps in the educational sense, is getting to people move out of their shell. I mean, one of the many axes on which we all sit is probably very visual at one sense, very literal. If I can't see it, isn't there, and extremely abstract at the other. And we would all benefit from being gently, not pushed, but offered reasons to move more towards the center, to experience more of the part of that axis that we don't naturally have or don't choose to have. It's just as some of the, you know, some of the stuff I was referred to earlier, I can really see how holding too tenaciously to one end or the other of that really holds people back in their ability to just make sense of what they have around them. Because otherwise their ability to understand is entirely restricted to people moving explicitly into their space and only their space or their method to interact, and that cuts down the chance for exchange of information and knowledge. And I saw Peter's point, and I thought, yes, I've been through that a lot at the moment. But it's an interesting thing that he's relating to, in the sense that how far down the rabbit hole we go in terms of sort of provenance, because you know, how many layers back do I trace something? Do I trace the parchment back to the cow it was on and which field it stood in? And I'm not trying to be facetious in that, but I'm just getting at this point that I have the same tick that he's sort of pulling out there, I think, in the comment in the chat, which is, okay, but I want to know where this, and I want to know where it was originally. In others, I want its source, and that's an entirely proper thing, I think, to want. But in a sense, the use of URLs and references to hold it all together has got remarkably broken, and especially this sort of ties back to the educational thing, that I don't think we've moved forward at all in terms of our improving our understanding of referencing. So we're still playing around with referencing that worked in 1950 in a very, very different space, not least of which much of the stuff we're trying to reference hasn't existed on paper and never will. And I think that's something we overlook at our peril. It doesn't mean throw everything away. It's more making some subtle adjustments and accommodations. And I can't remember, it might have been Peter, someone might have been in a completely different forum. Someone was commenting on the fact that how librarianship also hasn't really got with the digital age, apart from maybe putting their card catalog in a computer. But I certainly one who expected to see more sort of thought leadership from librarians in this area, but it doesn't seem to be happening. I think they're still busy doing their libraries just on a computer, which is a shame, because there's a vast, you know, a lot of thought in that discipline that's not getting shared around, and that's a sort of disappointment.
I put a link up to our website. I wonder if you have any thoughts, guys.
because it aligns with computational notebooks. To me, that sounds good.
Yeah, computational notebooks are absolutely fine as part of this. Yes, good point.
Because it's good, because it forces us to confront, well, what is the richness? And even if it's just a differentiator between U and L, like that doesn't worry me per se, because if nothing else, it gives you a division to say what you're not talking about. But I can also see when you were sort of first mentioning, what's interactive, I can see how a sort of loose interpretive description would drive computer scientists, people from sort of academic computer science, a bit mad, because it's not sort of hard-edged enough. But I don't know how you resolve that. I mean, not everything can be expressed in ones and zeros, or not neatly.
Yeah. WordPress is so weird to edit in. I'm looking
Yeah,
at,
I think Peter's point in the chat is very absolute.
yeah, I mean, I think it's crazy because in photography, we have obviously ways to store our photographs, but we don't use proxies in the same way. If you have a picture, you have a picture. Hardly anyone would have a photography album. Here, let me just share screen to talk about it. You've all seen it. I'm just going to open Photos, not even Lightroom. How do we store pictures here? We store them by picture. The picture is the key thing. We can change what size we show them and all of that kind of crazy stuff. But you have the picture. Sometimes you have a backup so that, it's online to save space. If I now drag this one over to share with you guys, it may take a second. But the crazy thing about a bibliography where it's expected that you may not have the item, I think we need to have a shift where it's expected that you have the item, but if you don't, you can have a placeholder for it, because we may all choose to, cite the King James Bible, which would be very expensive to own, for example. It's fine to have it, but it shouldn't be the default, right? Not in a digital age.
Well, I think, and I don't think this is anybody's fault that we got to where we are, but I think part of the thing is that you look at any reference manager and underneath it is a database. I don't think there are any of them that aren't really a database. But to please the sort of prejudices of the time, what they purport to show you are how it would look in your journal of choice. And the problem with that is, most of the formats are incomplete and not properly described in terms of the gamut of things that we have to cover. And B, they miss the point that what would be more useful in terms of interchange. If I said to you, blogs 2020, really what you want is all the information, that glob of information, and then you can turn it into whatever pretty description you want. Instead, what happens is I give you, or this is how it often happens, I give you a string of text, which you then have to, hopefully correctly, decompile back into the original things. So, in that sense, I think that whether it uses BibTeX or whatever, that part of visual meta strikes me as correct. The problem is that even there, it's a difficulty of getting to people to explain and agree what those parts are, and this is where it's a real shame that the sort of librarians haven't got off their backsides a bit more and joined in with the cataloging problems of this, which I think they probably do understand very well. So we're in this awful stage where not only do we have this sort of reference manager as a sort of best of the worst choices, but what's a title versus a book title and all of this sort of thing, which is both at one and the same time matters if you're trying to find stuff, but ought not to be it ought not to be an object that you would even have to ask about, you know. So if I was positing a sort of clear out of the stables on the start over, I'd just posit having a format where you looked at the existing media or the existing types of things. And it begs the question why they need to be. In some cases, you need different types of things, because obviously an artwork standing on a plinth is not going to have a number of pages. So, you know, not all fields fit all things, but I suspect we could get rid of some of the ambiguity that there is in some of these systems. And that alone, I think, would actually help a lot more in terms of citation, whether working from information that you have or being able to take information given to you by someone else and actually resolving it back to its original source. I saw Peter's comment. You'll be happy to hear that I realized for the talk I gave to Dini's class last week, I really would just have to do it as a PowerPoint, because then I could put stuff up and I could give it some sort of referencing and things. So my, shall I say to my own embarrassment, my half-hour talk had only 130 references, but you know, so the kids could learn. And obviously lots of things, a number of things had some multiple references, but so they were all done as numbers, in fact, superscript numbers, so that it was more readable. You could tell what was a reference and what wasn't, and you know, the left space on the screen. And I thought, well, that hasn't helped, because I can now give them a printed list of what the numbers are, but that doesn't help them at all, because as you rightly point out in the chat, where's the URL, for instance, because that's probably one of the first things you want to get at, you know, so you can check the reference, maybe find, and if you have can and have access to the document, you can get hold of a copy. So I ended up I did a sort of interim format that had all the numbers. Said, you know, number 4 is, you know, Ted Nelson's Literary Machine edition 87.1. You know, number 4, Ted Nelson Literary Machines edition 93.1. Sort of thing. And then I added to the script that I used to produce that a cite key, and then I gave them the whole lot again as every field I had in the BibTeX. I didn't. In the end, I just cludged it. So I said, just give them everything. Don't worry about whether it's a statue or a book or whatever. Here's the information. This is now you have tractable information that you can put in whatever tool you like, and you can use. Fred.
Okay, I have to ask the question of why. The reason I asked the question is a couple of things. First of all, you are an authority on this field. So if you say Ted did this because of that, you should be trusted. I don't have any problems with having citations to back up things, but you know, obviously.
No, that wasn't what I was citing. So this wasn't me doing a sort of humanities argument thing. I was sort of saying, look, in 1975, there was something called note cards. It was at Xerox PARC. Here is you know, some articles that actually describe this, because you can't see it anymore. And here's a reference to a book about PARC, because you might want to read some more, because this all happened before most of these guys were born. So that's what the referencing I was doing was quite different. This wasn't me sort of being close-grained humanity style argumentation. This was just saying, you're absolutely right. I wasn't expecting someone necessary to get to the end of the talk and say that's rubbish, this doesn't exist. I was just thinking that if I was the person receiving this lecture, I thought, I haven't heard about that before, that's rather interesting. How would I even find that? And so that was the point of giving them this, because they could take the BibTeX, feed it into whatever tool that they use, reference manager, or something.
Now it's getting interesting.
Which gets back to visual meta, because effectively, if you know, you could, if you squinted it sideways, what I really gave them as an adjunct to the PowerPoint presentation they've got was visual meta.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But now it gets interesting. Of course, it's nice for me to hear that. But also, when Les is our advisor, he was really interested in the reference section, not so much the citations in the document necessarily, but the reference section itself, which I thought was quite boring. But he had many ways of reading it. He would first of all check if the canonical sources were cited. He would skim through it, and for him, it was actual information. He even wrote a tool during my thesis, which was really fascinating, where it would show where in the document the citation showed up. And if they've been cited more than once, they will appear in a different color and so on. So I think we need to use a different language here, because you're not talking just about citations, Mark. You're talking about the thing that I've been requesting for a long time, which is kind of a knowledge DJ. Because one thing I would subscribe to would be Mark Anderson's hypertext RSS feed or whatever, where you give exactly this information, slightly annotated to say, this is interesting because of this or that. That's interesting. But for, a lot of presentations like you're doing here, it just seems almost like a waste of time, because the knowledge is important. Your perspective is important, but the way it's presented is just a list of references. Do we have something more exciting we can call it that is truer to what it can actually give us?
Well, the funny thing is, the preps took me far longer because, for instance, in double checking some references, as I'm wont to do, I discovered that Ted loaded on a lot of stuff to his Internet Archive. So there are now 3 different versions. 3 of the 4 primary versions of this book are now available, all except the latest one are there. You can read it as a PDF online in the archive. I wouldn't advise you to download the OCR text because it's rubbish. I mean, it basically needs to be completely by human, and I've done that for instance, one of the books. But what it made me realize is, I suppose my point, put myself in the audience. I'm about to hear about something that happened before I was born. And like the audience, I discovered hypertext as a subject through the web. I started using the web in like 94, I guess. And I sort of actually started websites. I think I wrote my first one about Christmas 1894. And I broadly worked on the web since. And so, but where do I find out about stuff? So I would say my impetus was less about being seen to, because I'm in doing argumentation as you do in a published paper. This was more about saying, well, kids, if you want to know more about X, here's a good place to start. Because places like Wikipedia are very inaccurate on a lot of it. And it's just not worth the time for you to get them.
Mark, I understand the motivation behind.
So,
I understand what you're talking about, but you're still talking about a list of references. Is there something more useful or hypertextual that the knowledge that you work so hard can be presented in?
I think there's also a problem. I mean, we bounce around terms like bibliography, reference, and citation, and I think they mean different things to different people. And I was having a real reviewer 2 moment this weekend, doing a peer review on a paper, because someone was telling a really interesting story, which they'd done by citing their own blog, which was completely useless. It was fascinating to be able to read the blog, but the blog was in no way useful to the reader, because these were past tense, to actually understand what was being referred to. And I suppose it goes back to this thing about, well, are you just writing to polish your ego, or are you writing to inform others? I mean, this person was clearly going to inform and not the, which is a shame, but hopefully we'll get a paper because it's a really interesting story. But it also made me think that in that circumstance, well, it's a bit like when there is a draft of my thesis, but in it there are over 1,000 references. That seems weird. Well, why? Because actually there are only, in terms of what you'd normally call a reference list, there are, actually, I think it goes up to about 300. But the other 700, because I happen to be working using Wikipedia as a source, they're all direct, very, very close-grained sources. So that's more the argumentation side. And in the end, I made 2 biographies out of it, because everyone I asked said, "Oh, just stick it all in one." I think that is not helpful. That's just going to confuse people. So there are things like you want to, we don't have a clear and agreed metaphor for saying, for instance, here's background fact for you, or here is this literal source of this thing, as opposed to this is the background to the thing that's being referred to. And both, I would argue, in circumstances are extremely useful. Fabian.
To go back to the question of could it be published in another format? So again, a little anecdote that somebody, I'm not going to mention name, but somebody contacted me to write something about the risks of the metaverse. And I basically replied, I can write, but I'm not necessarily that good at it. And what I find, well, I'm hopefully better at is designing a prototype for it. And the prototype can have a lot of different forms and shape, but hopefully does still answer the questions. Like you're asking a question, like what are, for example, the risks of the metaverse? And if you experience it, meaning, for example, I don't know, somebody shouts at you or get too close in your bubble, or you get information somehow about your movement or your camera, spies on you, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, the person was, that person is still thinking about it right now. And that was a discussion I had, like, I think early December. So I think there is also a bit of, the default format is for example, like flat text or 2 columns or a research article with a specific format. I want to say it's the easy way. It's still the harder way than just chatting or random email or whatnot. But comparing to the same quality of thought, let's say, and also sources and whatnot, but on top of it, something that you can, for example, if it's a computational notebook or prototype, it just does require more effort. So yes, it's definitely interesting, and I have a bias. That's why I argued for computational notebooks, and like the end of the book is because I think it's possible to do better. But yeah, it comes at a cost. It means the first step in that is like, okay, but how? Like, what are we actually going? How are we actually to do this? It's so much easier to put thoughts on paper or voice them because you can say whatever you want. I can say I'm an elephant, and even though I did take weights, not to that extent, but yeah, you can see that it's not true. Whereas if you build something, then people can poke at it. Like it's not as rigorous as a mathematical proof, but it is something, and thus you can poke at it. So I think as a different format, for sure, I mean, in regardless of the topic, there are other ways, but that means also that very first step of, okay, but what shape is it going to take? If it's taken seriously, it's always a genuine challenge.
Okay, so I just wrote something controversial because I think, Fabian, we're moving along the same type of line here. For me to have tried to get a PhD is basically a hazing ritual. There's also good things with the higher academia. So, but I'm saying there's definitely a part of it as in you have to walk over there, you have to wear this hat, and you have to sing sideways, right? There is some elements of that. And for me to have to define interactivity in a computer science PhD, for crying out loud, right? That's to me when it gets ridiculous. So what I wrote in the chat, and I think is really important here, because I think it connects Mark and Fabian, I think, is that when you cite what someone has done, it is to prove a point. It is to back it up. It's to cover your ass, right? And that can be really useful for someone in a field where they have to see where the original research was, or it can be really quite pathetic because you're just using some authority to back up your bullshit. Of course, that is entirely up for discussion, but I think, Fabian, what you are referring to is also citing for the future is for a dialogue. You know, if you're in a field, you tend to know the people in the field. So I think in our community, as an example, the reason I think it's so important to be able to cite an article in our book is not so that a high school student writes something to impress their teacher. It is so that there is a dialogue established. And that is why the notion of backlinks or link analysis is crucial, because a lot of, I'm an artist, I'm an inventor and philosopher. I'm not actually an academic. Chance of me getting the PhD is very small. That's fine. But the point is that you say something, Fabian, and I want to be able to credit you, agreeing or disagreeing or just saying it's cool. That is another kind of citing that isn't really academic, but it's so important. So when you have a computational notebook, as long as it has a robustness, then over time, Fabian said this thing, he hates books. He said it here and here and here. It should be instantly easier, of course, for someone to read that and to say, yeah, well, Fabian was actually right, so shut up, Frode. Or to be inspired by both our points of view. It is the threading of a dialogue. And hypertext, I think, especially in the 80s and 90s, were supposed to really help with that, especially hypertext on the web, to make a dialogue more connected. But then you got all these silos. And silos tend to die. Like we had a circle thing for a while and everybody hates everything. If you don't have an open way that robustly cites things and the things it cites stay, it doesn't matter what we want to build. We're building on air. Sorry, that became a bit ranty at the end there.
Not really. I mean, and the cyclical problem, the irony was, well, the web, through no fault of Berners-Lee, is sort of read only. So the links are stuck in the documents and then you go one way. So you have to have a whole new bit of tech to do the backlinks, because your browser back button isn't quite that, and that's before somebody doing SEO has suborned your browser entirely and sort of trashed all the backlinks. So you're right, but actually, most of us in the moment, citing is near on impossible, because unless you have something akin to a reference manager, even if you don't call it that, but somewhere where you store all this wonderful knowledge. For instance, a case in point would be Fabian's Wiki, for instance. I would say would be, a very good example of that something is not formally a reference manager, but it will contain a fount of wonderful information that, would, for instance, enable him to cite something if he needed to. So it's sort of quite difficult in the moment. And I just don't think we are particularly well educated to be receptive to things that are not strictly linear. I always find it fascinating by the people who say, oh, I never read footnotes. When you ask them, there's never quite a reason, except this is obviously it's a sort of social statement. I am this because I don't read footnotes. I think, well, that's your loss, mate. I mean, the point is you never have to, but they're there. The issue is not whether you read them or not. It's whether you use the affordance when you need to and when it's enabled, and you don't stop other people doing it because it's normally done for a reason. And in that way, I got given a lovely book over Christmas about Napoleonic convoying of all things. But what I loved was the gently sewn through it was the richness. So there, the person was citing the logbook of HMS Watt that this information comes. There were endnotes as well. There were also anecdotal footnotes on the page, which was lovely because you could flick on the page, I was reading paper, you could flick into the anecdote and out without losing the overall narrative. And that's a richness we've struggled to put into our sort of digital discourse, except via exploding it completely into a hypertext, which is fine, but I think a lot of people really, the more I see it, don't really understand how to read a hypertext. And a good example, this is where I love the connection, and Dini sort of said this the other day, and I was talking about hypertext conference being an interesting part where there was a bit of collision between the sciences and humanity, and she sort of shouted in my ear, and art. And I thought, absolutely right. Because the great thing about art is you can color out other lines because there aren't any lines. And the content of hypertext, it allows you to play fast and loose with the notions of what the text does and what it can be. And this with the eyes to see, or the mind receptive to it. I think it's quite interesting. I find it really interesting too that an essay she gave her students started with Mark Bernstein, who runs Escape, which is arguably now the remaining publisher of literary hypertext. saying when he first read the first literary hypertext, he didn't get it at all. He read it to the end and thought, well, you know, is that it? So exactly the thing. So I sort of, I clicked the first link on every page, so I got to the end. Now what? But that's not the point of the piece. But that's, I think he neatly encapsulated in that description how we react when faced with this richer capture of context of things. But it happens in places like academia because that's how it's structured. The harder part is, if you say in a business context, well, to what extent is that sort of referencing needed or wanted or even possible?
Right. So I agree, and this is important. And in a book, Kevin Kelly, obviously Ted Nelson hates him, but he wrote this beautiful book called Out of Control. In the book, he refers to a scene where a professor drops a pencil onto a table. And he says the problem with our Western thinking is that the pencil is more real than its motion. I think that really relates, because the connections between the citations or references or whatever they want to call them, the links, they go between documents. So that's why Doug was on and on about not only backlinks, but also link analysis and all of this stuff, right? I do think, and I saw Mark referring to RSS as being a bit much, I agree, but I do think that we need to find ways. I mean, Vannevar Bush's system, what was that? It was a collection of links. That's what the Memex was, right? So the kind of knowledge we're thinking about here is, today we started really slow. Now we're into something super important. A citation is there for a reason, and that's where we come into link types, of course. And link types can mean a lot of different things. This is becoming really, really important. And the reason I invented visual meta was initially the citing bit. However, when you're in manuscripts, when you are in an authoring environment, even if you're just doing stamp collecting, like we talked about earlier, even if that's all you're doing, just adding to it, if that adding actually is retained and you're allowed to interact with it, come back to rich interactions, then you, and like Brandl has said, you should be able to say, oh, the thing that I read about when I was at this bus stop, that suddenly becomes useful. And that is an in-between thing. So that is kind of a reference too. It's a reference to a location, what happened. I remember the first time I met Vint Cerf, it was for breakfast, which sounds funny, but my friend Fleur and I were doing a documentary on Doug. Vint was in town. We met him at the hotel, and he said, he talked about the notion of binding, but different from how we've used it. He said, for example, now that we all three have been at this restaurant, we are bound by this restaurant. These are really, really important things. And the reason I'm mentioning visual meta again, it's just these things need to be cheaply recordable. One of the things that was asked for my corrections in the thesis, why don't you use this, that, and the other? Why don't you use XML? And my reply to that is, of course, XML has no inherent structure. BibTeX does. There is a way, title equals title. You don't have to reinvent it. And then you look at all these other metadata stuff. It's all very, very expensive to fill it in. But I think that with us in the community, we can start coming up with what's happening here. Oh, okay. Sorry, Peter, just completely.
It's interesting what you say about being easily recordable, because, well, of course, another thing we've discovered in the modern age is if the four of us are in a cafe that's recorded, there are other parties that want that for a long reason. So none of these things are particularly simple. But I totally agree. This idea, the binding. I think one of the areas where I think we're still sort of not getting it right is that we are at the moment, for no real reason I can see, locked in a loop where what we want to do is we want our wonderful computers. We basically want to do the first bit. We just record some random stuff and then it magically sorts it out. And everything I see argues against that. And there are, so I don't know why we keep rushing at the opportunity to remove the human from the loop at the very point where they actually have most value to what they are either doing personally or for other people. Because there are some things that we can't yet compute. So, you know, what you compute is what you have to compute with, and often the subtleties of what you might want to compute at a later date are actually come from here, and not from all these artifacts around me, whether I'm sitting here and what color the light was, and, you know, what color jacket I had on. They're useful and we can keep them, but I think a slight challenge, which doesn't, I think, run at all counter to what you were saying, but it's this, so it's what do we capture? So how do we make it easier to capture the right things is a challenge I think we still face. Fabian.
It's not an answer, it's a potential answer, let's say. To me, it goes a little bit back to flattening. And if we talk about rich interaction with whatever, pure text or rich text or computational notebook, that's the tricky part, is we get some traces. It's not the same thing doing the thing as doing the, it's like somebody who does the, I forgot the name, but basically, I think it was in French also, but books where you had a number for each paragraph, and then you say, oh, I did this action, and I go on that page, I do that action, and go on that page. So you navigate through the book non-linearly. So it is, I don't know, but maybe I don't know this one. You basically make a choice. Yes, I assume so. That book does look nice. So it's non-linear, and somebody could give you their path through that book, but that would make no sense. Like, this is not, the very fact that you make a decision is important. So I don't think it's trivial. I also don't have an answer to this. What I did try today for completely different reason is I have my watch. It's not an Apple Watch, it's an open source one. And what I did was it vibrates, and it vibrates when on my experience, I pinch something and it executes some code. This way, even though I'm free hand tracking, I still have some haptic feedback. And it works, so I was surprised. But why do I mention this is, in order to do this, in order to do the vibration, what I do is I send it a notification. And the notification, if it can focus, but anyway, it's a piece of text. So I have the message and then the source, but I can also add like what has been executed. I can also add a timestamp, like that was at 3 p.m. this afternoon. I can add a location in space, like I was 1 meter forward, 3 meter back, etc. And it also means that now when I'm going to go have dinner, for example, I can go back to the list of notification, and I have flattened and quite harshly, but I have some trace of my rich, arguably, interaction session in VR. So I think that's one example. One could imagine that this actually produce an ID, and that ID goes back like a link to that position in space. So there are. Yeah, I don't have answers, but there are definitely interesting ways to do that.
I have an answer. Let's just figure it out together. My favorite academic moment as a teacher was when I hosted the Future of Text at London College of Communication when I was teaching there. And someone was doing... that's kind of irrelevant. Anyway, the point is that Vint Cerf was in the audience, right? And somebody was talking about, you know, oh, we can't do this, or that kind of moaning bullshit. And I was like, well, actually, when the ARPANET was invented, they were graduates. Oh, hang on a second. Here's Vint. Let him take over, right? It was like the McLuhan moment in that Woody Allen movie. The point of the story is, you don't have the answer, Fabian. I don't give a shit. Because there isn't an answer factory. All right, this truly, honestly is us. And if we manage to get it to stick, fantastic. But Microsoft's not going to do it. Apple's not going to do it. Google's not going to do it. Facebook's not going to, or Meta's not going to do it. The whole list of who's not going to do it is really, really long. So if you want to experiment with this, I'm not really allowed to do much paying for programming. I'll be happy to try to take it in and out of the flat media. I mean, one thing that would be absolutely amazing is, you know, I don't know if you know, because you're not a 100% Mac user, but if I copy something on my Mac and my phone is nearby, and then I go paste on my phone, it'll paste it automatically because they know each other, right? That is an amazing piece of text. But if you want to do something where you're in a kind of a VR environment and you copy whatever, if we can get that out of that environment and into a document as a footnote or as a citation or whatever the heck it might be after experimenting, so it'll have basic stuff and then it'll have, here's all these other goodies. That would be amazing. I mean, just imagine we now really focus on this in between connective bit, right? Imagine over time you've used it, and that means that in a year, you look at a document that is important to you, maybe it's your journal, whatever it might be, and you choose to look at it on a map. Boom, you have the locations as well, where you physically were. You know, you have access to where things was in the virtual space. And this is the crazy stuff, because this can then also be combined with all your other documents. So if you look at that and you go to that moment where you made that citation, you should be able to say, I was working with this weird guy, Peter Wasilko at the time. What did he suggest to me around this time? Right, we can start building absolute amazing information spaces. So the fact that you don't know, Fabian, just means we got to do it, right? I mean, you're one of the most important people in the world for this, because you're working for a collective political organization. Your remit is to make the life of every European better, right? You don't have a specific localized goal.
It's an interesting thing for as I think about it, for visual reality or augmented reality is, in terms of metadata, is sort of not just sort of what day it is, sort of time it is, but in, well, where was I in the environment? Or which way was I looking? Or what was in my field of view? Because we're quite visual people. So in fact, rather than an abstract reconstruction of stuff, that might be what you want to know. What could I, in other words, if I said to you, I was here, go to this place. If you want to see what I saw, go to this place. So how do you, I mean, I don't know how you did, I don't know how you define it in a useful and tractable form. But that's probably one thing we'll have to start to do as we use some of these spaces more, because it, in a sense, it's another reference. It's basically like, you know, saying go to page 49, paragraph 4. Will be, no, you need to be standing here looking this way at this sort of level of zoom. For that's probably a poor analogy, but you know, these settings, or you will not see what I saw.
I'm writing a thing here. I'm wondering, should we call out to the wider community to have a themed discussion on this topic soon? Something like this. This is an arty way of saying it. We'll have to say it better, but a discussion on the space in between. Right. Whatever we do, we cannot use the word metadata. We really shouldn't. You know, there's so many words we shouldn't use because they have such loaded. I'm clicking on your link there, Fabian. But do you agree, guys, that this is an important topic? Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah, perfect, Fabian. Absolutely. But we probably, in the real world, you know, this phone knows where it is. And everybody who can see it knows where it is. And digitally, all of this has to be stored, right? And, you know, many years ago, I read that interview with the developer of Crysis, the video game. And please stop me if I told you before, but he was asked, because this was an early game where wide open spaces and AI was really good. And he said the issue wasn't making the AI good. That's relatively easy. The issue was making everything know what it is. So a piece of wood would have to know, can you see through it? How much force to break it? would it burn? All these
6
things.
PM.
You know, this was obviously huge.
What's its motivation?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, but this was a huge inspiration for Visual Meta. Every document should know what it is, right? And now we're talking one step more interestingly, which is every moment or every location should know what it is, right? And what this is can go into all kinds of philosophical loops, but I think we could probably find something useful, right?
Yeah, and part of the point of motivation about formats earlier was just dealing with this difficult thing that to have the sort of granularity and computation tractability that we'd like requires quite a lot of fine-grained stuff, but capturing that in a way that doesn't send most people screaming from the room, you know, because most people will not want to look at in essence the code that lies behind this. I use code with very with quotes around it here, and it's not and nor is that sort of making a rude comment on sort of programming computer science, but more that how do we capture stuff that is not so abstract as to make it very difficult for genuinely difficult for a lot of people to sort of understand what it is that they're collecting, or for that matter, to be able to correctly communicate their intent to the device capturing things for them. It's sort of easier. I'm sure I can make an RSS feed for sake of argument of my bookends library, if I wanted to, and I might have to update every time I change something, and assuming I have to share it. But that would require other people to have a means, if they didn't know what RSS was, for someone to turn it back into something that would be normal for them. And that, I mean, that sounds rather trite, but I'm coming to see this more and more, that this is this real challenge. We're doing ever and ever more clever things using computational devices, but arguably a smaller and smaller number of people actually understand, sort of can see behind the curtain of how it's constructed, and have any hope of having a degree of control. The rest of us are working via proxy through something that looks comfortable for us. And I say comfortable, and I don't mean that, again, I don't mean that pejoratively, but some comfortable, or more to the point, understandable to us. I know where to, I need to put something into this. I need to know which box I put something in and why.
Yeah, and that's a key issue we have with what boxes this is. But what are the thoughts of maybe just try to continue this next Monday, or should we try to do a bigger discussion on this, or what?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the value is forking this stuff over. I mean, one of the problems with this sort of discovery is the more you try and decide what you're going to discover, the harder it is to do so. And I think all the biggest insights I've taken from the several years of conversations of this group have more been in the passing observations that people made, but often tangential to something else. So I think the area we're in. Sorry, I'm getting.
That's kind of. Sorry, Fabian, I'm muting you. There's some kind of feedback. Okay, so.
Well, yeah, just to say that, yeah. So I don't think we need to tighten things too much. I mean, if we run out of things to say, or we get to the point where we're in such disagreement we won't speak to one another, that's probably the point we need to change the focus. Otherwise, I think I felt today we're talking broadly within the ambit of sort of, text and education and things, or maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, we continue on Monday along all those topics. Thank you, guys. Really good to see you. And have a good week. Bye.
You too. Bye.